Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our online worship service. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister, and today I'm joined by our Assistant Minister, the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, our Membership and Communications Coordinator, Alma Vizcarra, and of course, our Music Director, Mark Vogel. Today, Mark is collaborating with the First Church Virtual Sanctuary Choir and Charlie Burris on guitar. This week, we are joined for the first time by a guest curator for our visual meditations. My brother, Joran Bossen, from the artist collective Durden and Ray. Today's sermon is titled, The Persistence of Mourning, and in it, I discuss how we can persevere in our mourning during this time when traditional rituals are unavailable to us. Saturday evening was when Eid started, and so today I would like to wish the Muslim community a happy Eid. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find our worship a source of comfort and clarity, and we invite you to join us each week for as long as we remain primarily online and in person as soon as it is safe for us to gather again. I invite you now to hear our call to worship.
Welcome, you who rejoice, you who long for connection. Welcome, you who mourn, you who long for comfort. In the Beatitudes, the teacher Jesus assured us that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Welcome, you who grieve, you who long for consolation, because you who mourn for what and whom you have lost have a community here. Join us together on this day as we give voice to our losses. Welcome, you who long for connection. Come, let us worship together.
Celebremos compartiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz. Return again, return again, return to the home of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the home of your soul. Return to who you are, return to what you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return to who you are, return to what you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the home of your soul and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the home of your soul and reborn again. Return to who you are, return to what you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return to who you are, return to what you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return
We pause now for a solemn time of ritual and prayer, remembering those who died too soon from violence and virus. Far more than the unofficial start of summer, Memorial Day is set aside to honor and mourn the military personnel who perished while serving in the United States Armed Forces. These individuals set aside their own safety for the greater good. They envisioned returning to a time of peace and prosperity. We remember them and honor them and thank them for the sacrifice they made. We light a large candle for all those who died in service to their fellow citizens of the United States. On this unique Memorial Day, we also pause to remember and mourn those who have died due to the pandemic sweeping our country and the world. There have been more than 5.25 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 340,000 deaths across the world. We light a candle for those countries hard hit by this and all those who have died across the world. There have been well over 96,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the United States, far more than were killed in the Vietnam War. Each of those represents not only an individual, but family and friends. We cannot light a candle for each of these, but each small candle we light represents more than 6,000 lives lost so far in this pandemic. Many of these individuals set aside their own safety for the greater good. Some were workers in the health field, and some worked to keep our supply chains open. They envisioned returning to a time of peace and prosperity. We remember them and honor them and thank them for the sacrifice they made. Some who have died were just children, and many others succumbed before we realized the danger. Some who died refused to set aside their comfort and safety for the greater good. Perhaps they underestimated the severity of the virus. Perhaps they didn't want to believe it could happen to them. Perhaps they grew tired of sheltering in place. We remember them and mourn for them as well. There have been nearly 1,500 deaths from COVID-19 here in the state of Texas. We cannot light a candle for each of these, but each small candle we light represents 500 lives lost so far in this pandemic. We have lit these candles to remember those who have died. I now ask that you join me in the spirit that some call meditation and others name prayer. Spirit of life and love, God of many names and mystery beyond all our naming, we come today to remember and to mourn. We mourn the life we once knew and took for granted, and mourn our inability to return to a sense of normalcy. But far more than that, we mourn those who have died. Especially we mourn those who have died far too young and those who have died unnecessarily. We mourn when our leaders are unable to find peaceful solutions, and we are thrust into war, costing lives. We mourn when our leaders are unable to advance sound science to protect our health and the health of our families, costing lives. Please help us as we work to ensure their lives were not in vain, by working toward a more peaceful and just world, and by working to hold these leaders accountable. Please help us as we work to love and support one another during these trying times. Grant us perseverance and patience. We pray in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We pray in the names of all helpers of humankind. May the congregation, absent in body, though present in spirit, say Amen. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. We lift up the Michaelides family as Evan's mother, Dr. Maria Michaelides, has passed away. Bonnie Ochoa, whose grandmother passed away. And, of course, all those who are struggling with COVID-19. I invite you now to say the name or bring to mind those you wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
This is
This morning's offering will go, as it did last week, to support the Community Projects Team COVID-19 Relief Fund. This is a unique ad hoc fund suggested by the Community Projects Team because of the pandemic. The Museum District Community Projects Team identified several nonprofit organizations who are established to administer food and medical assistance programs, and with whom we have long-standing relationships. As you might imagine, their resources are being stretched thin because of the crisis. The names of the 5 organizations will be listed at the end of the service and in the comments. These are organizations that long have been helping those in need and are now attempting to expand services to meet an increased need during this pandemic. We thank the Community Projects Team for identifying 5 organizations who reflect our Unitarian Universalist values and who will stretch each dollar we donate to help those in need. The offering will now be gratefully received.
First reading from Choose to Bless the World by Rebecca Ann Parker. Picture the universe as a bejeweled net, as a spider web covered with dew. Picture the web lasting only for an instant, then disappearing, and in the next instant reappearing again, only not the same as the previous moment. It is slightly different. In each moment, the whole is configured in a different way, and over time, over a series of blips, the net appears to be in motion, shimmering, or undulating. These shimmers are people running, tides moving, comets soaring, grass growing, suns burning, rocks eroding. In the people running, there are emotions flowing, thoughts forming and passing, things remembered, things forgotten. All of it is the cosmos in an ever-changing pulsation of becoming and ceasing.
Our second reading is from Burial Songs by Tao Chen. Boundless, in the boundless, weed-ridden wastes, white poplars moan in the wind. In bitter 9-month frost, come to this distant place, it's farewell. All 4 directions empty, not a house in sight. Looming grave mounds peak and summit. Wind moaning to itself in the branches here. Horses rear up, crying out toward heaven. Once this dark house is all closed up, day won't dawn again in 1,000 years. Day won't dawn again in 1,000 years. And what can all our wisdom do about it? Those who were just here saying farewell return to their separate homes. And though my family may still grieve, the others must be singing again by now. Once you're dead and gone, then what? Trust yourself to the mountainside. It will take you in.
all of it is the cosmos, an ever-changing pulsation of becoming and ceasing. So writes Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker. In the passage that I have selected, Parker's fine words on the bejeweled net of the cosmos conclude, stop, terminate, and finish with ceasing. This terminus point provides the beginning and the ending of my sermon today. Ceasing. I lift up this single two-syllable word because it reflects what many of us find ourselves struggling with right now: how to live with the end. Ceasing, death, the end of life. This is Memorial Day weekend, a time set aside for people in the United States to mourn the nation's military dead. The pandemic has rendered most of the holiday's rituals unsafe. It's unwise to gather in large groups and to mark the occasion with any degree of collective physical solemnity. At the same time, many of us need to mourn and commemorate our dead. The pandemic has brought with it a wave of mass death. There are now more than 95,000 people in the United States who have died of COVID-19. Globally, the figure is approaching 350,000. All lives that ceased, all people who are no more, and few of them have been traditionally mourned. The end is where we start from, wrote the poet T.S. Eliot. In the end, at the end, after life has ceased for someone we love, we start to mourn. Mourning is the grief we experience over death or loss. And on this Memorial Day weekend, a great many people are mourning. Mourning the dead, mourning what has been lost because of the pandemic, mourning jobs, mourning forms of free movement, the ability to go outside safely without wearing a mask, to maneuver through a store without social distancing, to walk into an office or factory without worrying that you will get sick, to eat at a boisterous restaurant, perhaps a little wine and jazz saxophone strains accompanying delicate fried eggplant or handmade pasta, a late-night bittersweet cocktail with a friend, that music joint with the hoppin' crowd and passionate dancing, all unsafe, all to be mourned. The end is where we start from. Ceasing, we begin with mourning. We will end with mourning. And the question I suggest we meditate upon is this: how shall we mourn? There is a strange way in which many of us are mourning. I've talked with more than a few of you in the past weeks who've lost a loved one, a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a friend. And you've each asked me a similar question: how shall we mourn? You were unable to say goodbye with a final visit, or you do not want to travel to where your loved one lived. It's unsafe to get on a plane or drive across country. And there will be no traditional funeral or memorial service for any time in the near future. Perhaps there'll be an online gathering, but you fear it will not be the same. No hands to hold, no hugs to give, no collective physical expression of grief, no sharing of a communal meal. How shall we mourn? How shall we mourn? How shall we mourn mourning? I will admit that I am uncertain exactly how to answer this question. We ministers are, of course, present for a lot of mourning. We're often there when someone dies. And we're versed in accompanying people while they mourn, facilitating memorial services, standing at graves, offering final summing words, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. These are reasons why there are clergy. And right now, this clergyman, at least, is not certain how we are to mourn. I have some sense of what we are to mourn and who we are to mourn, but how? I know only this. During this time of pandemic, we must create rituals for mourning, and we must think about what mourning is, what mourning serves the function. It's composite elements. And so we ask this question and then begin at the ending. For the end, as Eliot wrote, is where we start from. The end is where we start from. Ceasing, that moment when, as Tao Chen's ancient burial songs tells us, we find ourselves faced with the question, once you're dead and gone, then what? Let us begin, therefore, with death. There's no escaping it. Religion is our human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. Knowing we must die, we question what life means, wrote the late and somewhat controversial Unitarian Universalist theologian Forrest Church. Mortality confronts each of us. It's tender, haunting, unavoidable when the news of the hour contains stories of refrigerator trucks parked as temporary morgues outside of hospitals and litanies of names lost to the virus. The musician Mike Huckabee, the musician John Prine, the playwright Terrence McNally, the jazz musician Henry Grimes, the actor Leah Ferrero, the doctor Gita Ramji, the activist Lorena Borjas, the doctor Li Wenliang. The well-known dead are but a fraction of all those whose breaths were ceased by the novel coronavirus. Each but a flicker in the candle flames of our memorial lights. Each an individual who struggled with the dual reality of being alive and having to die. Each someone who mourned while they lived and having lived is now being mourned. Tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild, precious life, asked the poet Mary Oliver. We each live with the finitude of our lives. Each must answer the poet's question and decide how we will number our days. We love, we work, we go to school, we raise children, we eat, we play, we sleep, we write, we create, we make music, paint or toss clay, we garden, we cook. We do some of these things and make the stories of our lives, and then we die. And our deaths, our lives, our stories are no longer ours. There are those, of course, who try to control how they will be mourned. The ancient Egyptian pyramids were built by the pharaohs as burial monuments, imposing structures that would assure them immortality after their death and control the narratives of their afterlife. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I was obsessed with how he would be remembered, worrying that he would be forgotten with the tolling of the bell, spending lavishly on memorials while he lived, and believing, what I do not accomplish during my life for my memory will not be made up for after my death. I'm afraid that Maximilian was wrong. The ancient Greeks, however, were correct. They argued that we only know what someone's life meant when it was over. When a human being has died, we can safely pronounce that they were blessed, wrote Aristotle. It is not the dead, those we trust to the mountainside, who determine the meaning of their lives, not at least after they are dead. For after death, the task of making meaning of life is the task of the living. This was a lesson I learned at one of the first memorial services I helped lead. Shortly after I started seminary in Chicago, 2 of my friends died tragically in their early 20s. They had been husband and wife, and I knew them well. We had actually all lived together for a time. Unfortunately, they were estranged from their families. Their parents were the kind of evangelical Christians who believed that everyone in the BGLT community was going to be consigned to hell. Now, my friends were both practicing bisexuals. They were also what we called spiritual, but not religious. And these 2 facts were the source of their familial alienation. For they were open about who they were, what they believed, and they had fought a great deal with their mothers and fathers about their spirituality and sexuality. After they died, their parents invited their friends to their funeral service. It was presided over by a preacher who proceeded to narrate the lives of unknown people. My spiritual but not religious friends became devout believers in the purifying power of Jesus' blood. Their open marriage was transformed into a tale of pious fidelity. Their stories no longer belonged to them. Sometime later, some friends of mine and I organized a second service for our mutual friends. And I don't remember exactly how, but a portion of their ashes had come into our possession. Instead of gathering at a church, we decided to hold the service in the backyard of the apartment building where our dead friends had lived and where we had lived together and where some of our mutual friends still lived. We decided we would scatter the ashes in the back garden. The service began. A late autumn Chicago night. We had candles against the cold. The stars struggled through the murk of city lights. The wind came, damp and icy off the lake. Hearts heavy, we sat in silence. Then we said some words, read some poems, and spoke some prayers. After that, the stories started. They began somber enough, the attempts to reason through the unreasonable, the ache of loss, but slowly our spirits shifted. Someone shared about the couple's dogs. They had owned 2 toy poodles, and they loved to groom those dogs. It was almost as if they practiced topiary upon them. The animals' haircuts were often misshapen bouffants. Slightly smashed spheres, triangles, or even squares could be found on the ends of tails or atop canine heads. But that was not their most endearing feature. It turns out that poodle fur takes vegetable-based hair dye wonderfully. And so, on evening walks, the dogs would roam the lakeshore, a cascading calliope of electric blue, neon green, and shocking pink. I have to admit that thinking about those dogs still makes me giggle. Through those stories, the people that I knew and loved began to emerge. They were not evangelical Christians faithfully pursuing their salvation. They were creative, edgy bohemians living eccentric and eclectic lives that they were trying to make fully their own. They were my friends, and I had loved them. And as we told those stories, I recognized that I loved them still. Lightened by canine stories, grins on our faces, but damp still in our eyes, we knew it was time to scatter the ashes. Now, Chicago is not called the Windy City without reason. And the person charged with the task either made a miscalculation or simply was not paying attention. She tossed a big handful of ashes into the late blooming fall flowers, and they flew back on us, getting in our hair and clothes. A moment of shock, and then the laughter began. There we were, laughing and crying, not exactly knowing when one emotion started and the other stopped, covered in what someone euphemistically called dead girl. Baptism by ash. Have you ever had a similar experience? When in the face of something truly awful, the sheer, utter, unbridled joy of life crashes through? Now, unfortunately, such a memorial service is precisely what is beyond our limits during this pandemic. Nonetheless, there are lessons to be drawn from that remembrance that might help answer the question, how shall we mourn? First, we can create new rituals of mourning. Second, we can tell stories. Third, we can recognize that there is often beauty in pain or horror or loss. And fourth, we can remember that love is what remains. The end is where we start from, advised T.S. Eliot, and so let us begin with love, for love is what remains after death. The love we give to each other lasts longer than our lives. Love is what binds communities together. Love is what continues through the generations. And of these three remain faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love, the Christian New Testament tells us. The only thing that can never be taken from this world, even by death, is the love that has been given away before we die, the Unitarian Universalist Forest Church preached. In these strange days, we can begin to answer the question, how shall we mourn, with a simple remembrance that the love of the dead remains with us. Whether or not we can be present for final goodbyes or gather for funerals or wakes or memorial services, their love will endure. Like love, beauty often remains. Sometimes only in our memories and sometimes in the objects and creations our loved ones left behind. My grandmother, Dolores, was a wonderful cook. She created sumptuous Midwestern farmer's feasts for her family. Cornucopias of pies, garden fresh vegetables, rolls, hand-canned peaches, every time we came to visit. I particularly remember those pies, pecan, apple, pumpkin, rhubarb. They were beautiful to behold, slick with sugar, gooey, and with the ideal flaky crust. If Rembrandt had been a baker, he would have baked something like those pies. My mother makes wonderful pies, and I like to think that my own are not half bad. Certainly nary a child in my family has objected to them when offered the opportunity to consume such pies during a holiday festival. And there is something of the beauty of my grandmother's pies in those of mine and my mother's. Now, of course, my crust isn't quite as flaky, but when I share it with my family or eat one that my mother has prepared, it contains a portion of the splendor of my grandmother's cooking. Memories of my grandmother's pies include stories of my grandparents. My grandfather, for instance, loved to play a game with these pies. Once they were out of the oven, he would often secret them away to cool someplace. And it became an adventure for us grandchildren to find the pies so that everyone could gather for dinner. No pie, no dinner. We would search the garage, we would search the basement, we would search outside, we would look everywhere until finally we found the pies. Those stories make me think about my grandparents and the beauty and love that they left the world. And however strange it is in these days, however unsafe it is for us to gather, we can continue to tell the stories of those we've lost. We can mourn them through our tales, and in doing so, we can make sense of what their lives meant to us and what their lives continue to mean. We need not gather in person to share such stories. We can speak on the phone, we can write letters, we can post Facebook tributes, we can organize online services. For beauty, love, and story do not need physical in-person containers for us to hold them. They reside primarily inside our minds and our hearts, and are usually expressed with our hands and our words. Finally, in these strange days, we can begin to create new rituals. During this time of pandemic, I will admit that my own imagination runs somewhat bare in this regard. But my advice, nonetheless, is to think expansively, imagine, remember. When the Detroit techno artist Mike Huckabee died of COVID-19, many of those who knew him remembered him by playing some of his music and by sharing stories with each other about him, either over social media or in private correspondence. I spent about 4 days just listening to old sets of his that are either in my collection or available someplace online. It was not the same as attending a funeral, but it did awaken in me some of the love and beauties and stories that he left the world. And perhaps this points to the kind of small rituals we might create during this pandemic period of mourning. We might take the time to honor, love, beauty, and the stories of those who died in whatever ways we can while we are alone. You could take some time and make the favorite dish of your lost loved one, or you could plant or cut flowers that they liked, or look at a beautiful object that they left you. It need not be fine art. I have a tarnished silver cup from one of my grandparents that I treasure. You can write the funny stories that they told you that you can recall down, or set aside an hour or a day or whatever time you need and light a candle and say a toast to their memory. It might be that such rituals help you even if you cannot gather for a funeral. Love, beauty, story, and small ritual, we can hold on to these, use these to help us mourn during this time of pandemic. They might not fully substitute for being present for last moments or gatherings, but they will help us remember it is we the living who mourn, and that it is we the living in which the sparks, nay, the flames of our loved ones endure. Picture the universe as a bejeweled spiderweb covered with dew. The net appears to be in motion, shimmering or undulating. These shimmers are people running, tides moving, comets soaring, grass growing, suns burning, rocks eroding, and all of it is the cosmos, an ever-changing pulsation of becoming and ceasing. Rebecca Parker's words come back to us here at the end as we cease our sermon. They can help us remember that it is we, the living, who endure, and that the dead endures in all that is, all that was, and all that shall be, in the complicated whirling mass of the cosmos and light that we are all part of in our temporary sojourns upon this planet. And so in that spirit, in that ending, I invite you on this Memorial Day weekend not with an amen to consider the end of the sermon, but with an invitation to gaze back at our candles of commemoration. Each light represents some of those who have been lost to the virus. Each light contains a vast sparkle of love, beauty, and story. Each light a shimmer of the cosmos, rising up and then falling into silence, but remaining as we mourn in the beats of our hearts, in the sounds of our words, and in the work of our hands. Look at the candles and remember in silence those whose lives are no more.
What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this that brings my heart such bliss and takes away the pain of my soul, and takes away the pain of my soul. was sinking down, sinking down. When I was sinking down beneath my sorrow's ground, friends to me gathered round. Oh my soul, friends to me gathered round. Oh my soul. To love and to all friends I will sing, I will sing. To love and to all friends I will sing. To love and to all friends whom pain and sorrow mend, with thanks unto the end I will sing, I will sing. With thanks unto the end I will sing.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
To love and to all friends, I will sing, I will sing. To love and to all friends, I will sing. May we end this Memorial Day weekend service with the song of love awoken in our hearts, stories of those we have lost upon our tongues, and the beauty that has been left behind around all of us. Go in peace, go in love. May our lives be a blessing. Amen.
While our church as buildings is closed, our church as people is still meeting, but now online. There are weekly and monthly offerings to keep you connected and engaged with our community. Reverend Scott is again holding online office hours on Monday evening, and Reverend Colin is hosting Texts for Troubled Times on Tuesday. Please email info@firstuuhouston.org in advance for the links so you can engage the ministers. Please go to our website, firstuuhouston.org/online-group-meetings for more details. And remember, all times shown are Central Standard Time.